thanks everyone for coming here. We're going to talk about PRVC and how it sucks, how it's the worst mode, I think, and how I think a lot of times it's sort of used not, I wouldn't say not appropriately, but definitely more so as like just a mode that people default to and that no one puts a lot of thought into actually like what is happening. So as a short aside, who I am Nick Gioni, Pulm Toilet, aka I am a pulmcrit doc from Philly originally, trained in DC. I'm a part of a vent course, teach the vent, etc. We teach the vent to sort of fellows and attendings throughout the country, et cetera. It's a year long. I've been doing it for about 3 years now. We have a bunch of fellows involved and sort of was on Twitter and then took my stuff to Instagram because Twitter sort of fell apart, obviously. So when we talk about adaptive modes, like what are we talking about essentially? So adaptive modes, they come in all different shapes and sizes. They're all basically the same thing, but depending on the vent company that you use, so Draeger or Puritan Bennett or Hamilton or McKay, which is getting now. I don't think it's Simmons anymore. I mean, AVAPS also falls into this as well as like volume support. So all of these are the same thing, are different names for the same thing, which is adaptive, sort of an adaptive targeting scheme, meaning the vent is going to adapt to something, and that something is the compliance. So the vent is adapting to the compliance when it's trying to sort of figure out how much pressure it needs to give in order to get whatever total volume you set into the patient, which is why a lot of times I think attendings mostly or attendings and RT attendings, residents, fellows, etc., nurses, everyone, we sort of think that this is like a volume control mode when in fact it's not a volume control mode. It's a pressure control mode. So what does the adaptive mode mean? So an adaptive mode of ventilation is one where the vent adjusts on sort of a breath to breath basis the pressure that it's applying to the airway to drive in the volume. It's adjusting that based on what it thinks the compliance is. The vent can't sort of see what the compliance is. It can estimate what the compliance is based on the airway pressures. It's assuming a few things, and in those assumptions is where you get sort of caught up, which is an issue. So, this comes up not infrequently, and you can sort of take this to the bank and like on Round Smart or something. So these modes, PRVC, volume support, APV, all this stuff, these are pressure-based modes, and they're pressure-based modes for three reasons, essentially. The first reason is that the flow and the volume are unfixed variables, so they can change in the breath. Whereas with volume control, those things, so pure volume control, those things are fixed variables. They don't change in the breath. They do not change. So even though it's pressure-regulated volume control, and some attendings will sort of battle you to the death that it's volume control, it's in fact not volume control. And the fact that some attendings think it's volume control is really concerning because that means that they don't understand sort of like what they're doing. So number one, the flow and volume is unfixed variable. Number two, the pressure is a fixed variable. It doesn't change during the I time. So during the inspiratory time, the time in inspiration, whatever the pressure is, 15, 20, 25, 30, whatever it is, it doesn't change. It stays the same. So the pressure isn't changing. Now, it'll change on the following breath. It'll either go up or down or like sort of depending on what the patient needs. But during the actual breath, it doesn't change. So it doesn't go up. So which is one thing that sort of makes it pressure control. Number three is the cycling mechanism. So how the vent knows to go from inspiration to expiration. So in pressure-based modes, the inspiratory time is something that we set. That's the cycling mechanism. In PRVC and APV and all these things, we're setting an I time. So we set the I time 1 second, 2 seconds, not 2 seconds, that'd be long, but 1 second, 0.9 seconds, zero point 0.8 seconds, whatever it is. We're setting the I time. So because of those three things, PRVC, these adaptive modes, they're not volume control modes, they're pressure controlled modes. So flow and volume are unfixed variables, number one. Pressure doesn't change during the inspiratory time, number two. And then number three, we are setting the inspiratory time. Because as you may recall, in volume control, the cycle is sort of the flow or the volume. So, if you get the volume in faster, i.e. have higher flow, then your inspiratory time is going to be shorter. So the way that we fix or change the inspiratory time in volume control is to play around with the flow. In PRVC and pressure control, for that matter, we're not playing with any flow or flow in that sense. We're actually changing the I time. We're changing the time that you spend in inspiration. So I ripped these right from the manuals of getting, and I think Puritan Bennett. And just as like fun fact, if you guys never looked at the vent manuals, they're actually really good as far as talking about things that they talking about like different things in it. So they have like some physiology stuff, they have some waveforms, they talk about what they do. A lot of this stuff is like buried in the algorithm. The algorithm is proprietary, so there's some things that we don't know. But essentially how it works is in the initial, if you dial in a total volume of 300 or 400, whatever it is, and then you set you give some, you say to the vent, okay, deliver this volume, and it's delivering 500 cc's or something. The next breath, it's going to sort of pressurize a little bit more than the PEEP, so up to maybe like, I don't know, like in this mode, it's in a sorry, in Puritan Bennett, it says that it goes 5 above PEEP. And essentially what it does is it delivers a volume controlled breath. It delivers a volume controlled breath, and then it figures out the plateau pressure. Once it knows the plateau pressure, at end inspiration, if the airway pressure equals the plateau pressure, then if it knows all the variables, which we'll go through, which is it knows the airway pressure, it knows the volume, it knows the PEEP. From those things, it can figure out the compliance and then adjust accordingly from breath to breath. So if you look when, if there's RTs here or whatever, whoever sort of sets up the ventilator, if you set up APV or PRVC or whatever, and you look at the first breath, it's a volume controlled breath. And I actually have a picture of that and I'll show you. So that's how the vent knows to start, like what pressure to sort of start at. So, like I said, what is this assuming? This is assuming that, and this figure I got off of VentSim, which is something that is a simulator that I use online. It's actually really good. It's free, and you can sign up for it through your Google account. But what it is assuming is that, so if you remember, this is the equation of motion, sort of the workhorse, the thing that explains everything that we talk about. It seems a little kind of like not useful, but I think if you really understand this, it can help you a lot. So what this assumes that at end inspiration, the flow is going to go to zero. Therefore, your flow times resistance component drops out. So then your airway pressure equals your alveolar pressure, also known as your plateau pressure. So the vent now knows the airway pressure, the volume, the compliance, and the PEEP total. So on the subsequent breath, it can calculate. So if this was like way off, but it knows the compliance now and it knows what volume you're targeting, it can just plug this stuff in. So volume, compliance, and the PEEP, and then solve for that and get an airway pressure that needs to pressurize to. The problem is that number one, it can't see auto PEEP, so that's a problem, right? So, it doesn't see auto PEEP, and how that's gonna sort of play out is that auto PEEP makes compliance worse. So when it sort of pressurizes to that number, it's not going to deliver the volume. Then on the subsequent breath, it's going to have to pressurize more. And then it's always sort of chasing its tail, and auto PEEP really makes PRVC struggle in a lot of ways. But that's, a story for another day. So what it's assuming though is that you have natural decay of the flow. So the flow is going to zero. As we know, a huge disadvantage to this is when patients are spontaneously breathing, it doesn't always follow this natural decay and flow. It doesn't always go to zero. So the vent's assuming things that it shouldn't because flow isn't going to zero. So things like high work of breathing and high effort, it can trick the vent into thinking that the compliance is better because if you need 20 centimeters of water of pressure to deliver the volume and the patient does 10 centimeters of water, then the vent only needs to do 10 centimeters of water. But that means that the patient's doing work on the vent. And although we want the patient to do some work on the ventilator, we don't want them to do a lot of work on the ventilator. And one of the big Achilles heels of PRVC is that, and sort of adaptive modes, is that if you have a high drive to breathe, it's going to support you less and less because the vent assumes that the compliance is better. So this is from this book, Essentials of Mechanical Ventilation, which is actually like my favorite vent book by Hess and Kazmarchek. It's my second favorite book because my vent book will be the first favorite book. So this one will be second. But this is right out of this book. So essentially what the vent's doing is we're setting a volume, it's calculating a limit, you're going to trigger it somehow. So either, flow, pressure, time, it's going to pressurize to some number that it calculates based on the compliance. Once it does that, it will then pressurize to that number for the time. Once it pressurizes that number for the set time, It'll go through the eye time and then it'll cycle off. And then the vent will think to it'll know if it delivered the volume. And then depending on the volume that it delivered, it'll recalculate the compliance. So on sort of a breath to breath basis, it's calculating the compliance because it has to know in the subsequent breath if it needs to go up or down or sort of stay the same. Now, the point is that, if there's something that changes in the breath, so the resistance goes up within the breath, let's say, the vent isn't going to react sort of in that time frame, meaning it's not going to react in the breath because remember it's pressure control mode, so it's going to pressurize to some number and stay there. It can't increase the pressure while you're in the breath, so it might not deliver the total volume. On the subsequent breaths, it's going to have to sort of step the pressure up. Now, some people will say PRVC is good because it sort of adapts to the changing mechanics of the lung. I personally would disagree with that because it doesn't adapt to the changing mechanics of the lung in real time. It does eventually, but something like volume control will adapt to the mechanics of the lung in real time because it has to deliver a volume. So if your resistance goes up, it's going to pressurize more in the breath because the pressure in a volume controlled mode is an unfixed variable. It can go up and down. So this is just sort of like some to get, a mental framework around as far as how adaptive modes work. So in order to understand adaptive modes, what you have to understand is volume control square flow. The reason you need to understand volume control square flow is because the studies that compare volume control and PRVC, where we get this, PRVC is superior because it's less pressure, blah, blah, blah. This is all comparing it to volume controlled modes that are square flow. So, but there's what it comes down to, it's just math. And if you understand the math, then you can sort of like start to take apart this, this theme that PRVC, delivers volume with the least amount of pressure. It's compared to volume control with square flow, which, I don't use it a lot. I don't know if you guys use it a lot, drop it in the chat. I'd love to hear if you guys use volume control with square flow. Square flow is really not that comfortable because it's not how we breathe normally. So normally how we breathe, we have sort of more of the flow up front and then it dissipates over time. Square flow just gives you, some amount of flow consistently through the breath. And from what I'm told, it's uncomfortable. Can't anymore with the T1 lulls. Yeah, you can't anymore with the T1 because the T1 doesn't do pure volume control modes. The Hero Vent by Ventus, which I played with at Soma this year, they do volume control actually. And the dude is supposed to actually drop a vent off to me at some point and I can play with it. But the reason why you can't do it is because the T1 doesn't do any volume control modes. The T1 only does pressure control modes. Sadly, Melody's not here because she's sort of the Hamilton queen. I don't use Hamilton much. I have servos. Okay, so we talk about Ohm's law, equation of motion. I know this is like, bang your head against the wall type stuff, but I feel like it's really not that difficult if we can walk through it easily. Number one. Number two is that it's going to explain a lot of stuff. So very simply, the equation of motion, so pressures and flow in the lung, your airway pressure is equal to your your airway pressure, P airway, is equal to your flow times resistance plus your volume over your compliance plus your total PEEP. Meaning, if you had all these numbers, flow, resistance, volume, compliance, PEEP, you can plug and chug them, and then you can predict what the airway pressure will be. Which is, I don't know if it's useful, to be honest with you. Like, is it useful at the bedside? I'm not sure. But I think it's important to understand the mechanics behind it because it explains a lot of things after. So I use the what do you call it? The airway simulator. And for all the same mechanics, I put it through. So this one here, so the first one is volume control. The second one is pressure control. The third one is PRVC. And then the fourth one is volume control square. So, the airway pressure here is 18. Airway pressure in PC is 17. Remember, in pressure control, we're controlling the pressure. So, like, I set it to that to sort of get a volume of 500. In PRVC, it wound up being 17. And then in square flow, it wound up being 25. Now, what's up with that? If it's all the same mechanics, why is your volume control square flow, why is it higher peak airway pressure than the rest of them? So what it comes down to is the equation of motion. So if you have your airway pressure equals your flow times your resistance plus your volume over your compliance plus your PEEP total, and I just picked everything normal. So the flow is 60 liters a minute, so that's 1 liter per second. Your resistance is 10 centimeters of water per liters per second, which is normal, plus a 500 cc total volume over a normal compliance, so 0.05 liters per centimeters of water, plus 5 centimeters of PEEP. Okay. I know this is like very confusing, but I promise it's going to make sense. So we have your mechanics, we got your air, we have your equation of motion, we have your numbers. So if we go through, we're going to cancel out all the liters. So liters are gone. Then we're going to cancel out all the seconds. Seconds are gone. Then we're left with pressures. So we're just left with 10 centimeters of water for your resistance component, because 1 times 10 centimeters of water equals 10 centimeters of water. If we go over to your elastic component, so this is your alveolar pressure, your plateau pressure. If you do 0.5 liters divided by 0.05 liters, that gives you 10 centimeters of water. So we cancel out the liters. So 10 centimeters of water plus 5 of PEEP, that equals 15. So your area pressure, if you do 10 plus 15, equals 25. So if you had to guess, and and you can if you want, not sort of held to it, but if, you know, if I said the area pressure is 25, what mode would this be? Like, would it be PRVC? Obviously not. Would it be PC? No. Would it be decel? No. It'd be square. It'd be square because in square, the flow times resistance component of the breath never goes away because the flow is constant. So there's always a resistive portion of the flow. There's always a resistive portion of the peak area pressure that's from the flow times resistance component of the equation of motion. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that because there's constant flow, there's going to be constant pressure. So when we compare, so when the studies, and I'll show you them later, sort of one of the studies from 1999, when it compared PRVC to volume control and said that PRVC had less airway pressure, you should expect that because it was comparing it to volume control with constant flow. So because of how the equation of motion works out, it's going to be higher because there's always a flow times resistance component of the pressure in the airway pressure in volume control with square flow. Okay. Do all my Zoom friends and all my TikTok friends understand that? You can drop stuff in the chat, ask questions, come off mute, etc. Jordan says yes. Jordan's a smart dude. So this is an important piece because in volume control, there's two sort of flavors of flow. There's decelerating flow. So decelerating to some number, either zero or something before that. I usually just put it to zero. Or, the sort of the extreme opposite of that is constant flow. So most people don't use constant flow because it's really not comfortable for the patient. Sometimes we use constant flow to look at the stress index in ARDS because that can sort of predict if we're over or under peeping a patient based on how the sort of the line looks, this line here, sort of this top line, if it's sort of concave, convex, you're either under or over peeping the patient. Sort of we're trying to transduce the alveolar pressure to see if we're under peeping the patient, meaning as we give more and more volume, we're still in the ascending point of the pressure volume curve, or if we're getting more pressure as we give more volume, we're sort of above the upper inflection point of the pressure volume curve. So the only time we really use volume control with constant flow is when we're, at least me, I only use it when we're doing the stress index in ARDS. Maybe some people use it in other, maybe some people use it other situations. I usually don't. So it's sort of disingenuous to say that, PRVC gives you the least amount of airway pressure compared to volume control because that's really not true. And it's only true for constant flow, but you should expect that in constant flow because since the flow is constant, there's always a contribution of the pressure from the flow times resistance component. Okay. Because there's always flow. Now, how does the vent know sort of what to pressurize to in these adaptive modes? So as I said before, what we're going to have is, so this is the first breath when we dialed in, and this was actually like not that long ago. I took this picture like maybe a week ago or something. So the total volume was like 500 and we dialed in 500. And then the first couple of breaths, it does this. So it does a volume control breath because what it's trying to do is it wants to get the plateau pressure. Once it knows the plateau pressure, it can back calculate. So if it knows the plateau, what the vent says to itself is, okay, the plateau pressure is blank. So if I want a volume of 500, so it's going to do 500, and then our PEEP is 8, right? So it's going to do 500 plus a peep of 8 over the compliance, which I don't know what this compliance was. I get, the dynamic compliance is 45, but just say X for now. So what it's going to do is it's going to solve for this equation, and then it's going to get an airway pressure. And then on the subsequent breath, it's going to pressurize to somewhere around that. But remember, that's presuming that makes the presumption that it's going to go to zero. The flow is going to go to zero. It's going to be natural decay. Now, we don't know if the